I will say, it's a lot easier singing about the goodness of God than speaking it. Good morning to everybody here. Thank you so much for being here and being willing to get to know me a bit this morning. God is good, and it's interesting singing that last song there. All my life you have been faithful, all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. And although He has always been faithful, I have very much not. There's been quite a turbulent kind of relationship with God and the church, which you'll learn about in a little bit here. But just in regards to music, before I get into the rest, it has been such a privilege to be able to grow in singing and music here. When I came, I was voiceless. I had taken some years of musical theater lessons in an effort to get my voice to where I could be in church and not be constantly worried about how my voice sounded. And unfortunately, what happened was I built a whole bunch of skill and absolutely no ability to use it because I was so terrified. And I took about 2 years off of singing. I wouldn't look at sheet music, wouldn't do anything. And there was quite a bit of layers of personal stuff. You could say personal traumas, religious traumas, that kind of stuff. And over the past while, having you guys embrace me up, being able to sing, work with the team, and get so much encouragement from everybody here singing, that God has brought me on this amazing journey to being very happy and comfortable with Him in using my voice in that way. Enough for this. And I do want to say before I get any further, my goal is to be as open and transparent as possible within the relational space being held here today. With that being said, if anyone has any questions or would like a deeper knowledge about how God has worked in my life than I am able or willing to share here, I would love to talk in a smaller, more personal setting, such as over coffee. Each person has layers of identifying titles. These may include performer, father, daughter, teacher, auntie, actor, singer, and each one holds special meanings in and to the life of their bearer. Let's take my title at work. One could say I am an assistant manager, or one I could say I am the mistake catcher and fixer, because my job as a leader is to set the vision and then provide the skills and support for the individuals on the team to be doing their job. I get that sort of vision from my boss, and then we look at how we want that to work, play, or manifest out. To me, it's all about that held relational space and developmental milestones. When I first get to train a new hire, I have no idea what their relational space is to my title of trainer and manager. In my leadership writings for work, there is this little phrase about acknowledging that each individual brings their humanity and unique lived experience into the store. How they relate to me is an accumulation of me as a person and their lived experience with the other people that have had that title that I now hold in their working life. This means their expected behavior from me, whether positive or negative, initially has more to do with other people than with me. My goal is that after initial foundational training, without hesitation or fear, they will come to me to fix or guide them through their mistakes as they grow. I call them my kids, the teenagers. I kind of have this attitude where it's like, if you can make a mistake that I have not made or that I cannot fix, I will be very impressed. Because the relational space I want them to have with mistakes and with me is that they are totally willing and safe to take that step forward, try something, learn something, and fail, and then be secure to do it over and over and over, knowing that at any point they can just come get me and work through it. Now, why did I open my testimony talking about work? There's two reasons. Because I'm quite comfortable talking about work. I know it very well. And it's easy to talk about. I can train new people, supervisors, and leaders at work without even thinking about it. There's so much lived experience there that it's almost just an intrinsic knowledge at this point. And the second point is that work is what showed all my cracks and highlighted my misaligned foundations and trauma responses. I started working at this Tim Hortons on December 27th, 2022. I had worked previously in Kamloops for 4.5 years, over 2 stints. And the second stint was in alignment with a very standards-focused church. So I ended up bringing a lot of that leadership into my working leadership. And I was able to see that here. That time is also around the time I remember writing to God saying, I'm floundering and I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to trust you. But see, that's not where the story starts. And before we continue, let's take a moment to look at my church history. And I'm intentionally and clearly separating my church history from my story with God. Because see, they are two separate but interdependent relational spaces. However, by having them wrongfully enmeshed and a codependent relationship on the church and leadership, I almost died. And even though I didn't die physically, I definitely had times where I was living through a spiritual death. So go to the beginning is to go back to when I was a little child. Before I remember going to church, my mother remembers me and my best friend at the time having to be separated from a fight by our pastor. Now, I'm not sure if we were rolling around on the floor or like punching each other out, but we would have been about 4, and the pastor had to physically separate us. It was a little Pentecostal community church in Kamloops, where Amy and I actually got into a fair amount of trouble. Apparently, it is also frowned upon to judge ministry workers' coffee making skills, especially when you are 5. But that is about the time when my memory kicks in. I enjoyed Sunday school, getting candy from the nice lady in the back of the church, and messing around with my friend. That church shut its doors in what would have been 2005, 2006. And thus, when I was 6, we started attending Berean, an independent fundamental Baptist church in Kamloops. Attending there, I remember my loving Sunday school teacher and their children's church called Trailblazers. The format of the day was Sunday school, worship service, and then the 5 p.m. evening service with a midweek service and prayer time. And I would often spend the afternoons with my best friend and her family. And it's funny because I can cognitively remember deciding to wiggle around in Sunday school so I would have an easier time sitting still for children's church. At the time, I thought it was fun. We got to have matching uniforms and I got to spend time with my friends. There were fun songs and cool prizes. When I was around 13, we left Berean and went to Calvary Community Church in Kamloops. I was able to grow under the care of youth pastor Andrew Jagger for 2 years before he moved on to become the associate pastor, leaving us with a fresh grad from Bible school. Unfortunately, our youth group and the job made quick work of him, and he got fired after a short stint. In 2016, when I would have been 16, we transitioned back to Berean Baptist, which is where we were prior to coming here in 2021. So now you have the physical history and timeline, which is the easy part, but also some of the foundational places where my lived experience, perspective, and stuff, my story takes place. See, I didn't really know much about God at Cornerstone. I was a small child, but I remember comfort, having fun with my friends, and being helped with a really cool craft by a very loving lady. In my first stint at Marine, I remember loving the songs in Trailblazers and how fun it was to get into uniform for children's church. But I also remember all the anxiety, or held fear, of having to sit still and offer good performance behaviors in church. At the time, I thought those uniforms were a cool way of developing belonging and a sense of togetherness. And unfortunately, I later learned that they had been a way of keeping all the girls in class in line with the church's standards. We had been given uniform jumpers in case we had kids from the world come in, so their outfits wouldn't be seen if we performed anything. Inevitably, what I learned was that I could not be outside of their standards of behavior, and that it was through perfect behavior that one remained safe and pleasing to teachers, parents, and thus God. When I talk of performance behaviors, this is the behavior we show to cope or keep ourselves safe in a given situation or relational space. It is a true action, but caused by fear. And the reason I go into this is because it plays a big part in my kind of internal story. There's a psychology phrase to explain this, and it says that we will only live in or show the identity we are safe in. So just so we're all on the same page, this is kind of the basics of how I break it down. So there's like an authentically connected, and so how I feel and what I show or communicate are in alignment. There's acting, which is totally willfully pretending to be something, often for the purpose of gain. In the real world, it's just straight up lying. And then there's the performance behavior. And these are developed through the use of threat or oppositional force. I have to be something that I don't internally have. It's connected to external fear, not placed values. Now, the difference between these can only be found in heart posture. For example, in authentically connected, I can securely say, I am nervous to get up here and share my story. And you might not be able to see it well because I have the confidence in Christ that He is holding me every step of the way. But in all honesty, my flesh is nervous to get up here and share. That vulnerability is a little scary. But the internal placement is being connected through the values and the held belief that every moment with God is important. And that through Him, I will have the strength to share it, and through His Spirit, He will hear and learn. Now, I did learn a lot about dedicated service at Marine, and from the time I was 6 to 9, I loved being a fiery little church mouse. I believed in God and wanted to please Him. I sang with the children's choir, I baked for funerals, and was in piano lessons until our music teacher moved away. It was great, and I enjoyed my life. But when I was 9, my world came crashing down. One Wednesday evening in January, instead of meeting my dad out at Wendy's or Senior Froggy before heading off to church, as was our custom, we gathered in our living room. I sat beside our Christmas tree as my dad came home and leaned against the treadmill and said, I can't do this anymore, this believer and unbeliever. In hindsight, now he was referring to my mother, a believer who regularly and always took us to church. But situational context matters, especially when you're 9. And I learned that my dad had just left me because I believed in God. And the sweet, but at times fiery daddy's girl in me had to die in order to survive. I had overheard my mother saying some stuff about it, and it solidified my belief that God was entirely at fault for me not having my dad, and I hated Him for it. I took on the belief that it didn't affect me, so I remember deciding I wasn't going to smile anymore, and eventually taught myself to go numb and hard. We continued at Marine, and I acted out the Christian culture there. With so many standards, it was easy to fake my way through until one night I realized that I was a sinner and that I needed a Savior. I did go home that night and prayed, but I never told anyone and definitely did not live a life with Christ. Fast forward to, I want to say, January 2013, where after years of looking like a Christian girl, We are now attending Calvary. Andrew shared a devotional on looking like versus being a Christian, using a hockey player as an example. That evening, as we went down to an interchurch New Year's prayer session, and while singing Amazing Love by Chris Tomlin, I was hit. There are words that say, "In all I do, I honor you," and I realized that I really didn't. I turned to my sister saying, "I'm not a Christian, but I want to be." And then grabbing a youth leader, went out to the foyer to pray together. And that started my journey of actually growing in the faith. As a side note, now knowing the fallibility of myself, I mentally changed that lyric to a prayer that goes, "In all I do, I want to honor you." In the youth group, almost all of us came from broken homes. Andrew was able to identify my angry brokenheartedness and was able to provide the care that we as a group needed. In 2014, I was able to attend Street Invaders in Surrey. And how that's set up is there are 5 days of boot camp, which is hard work, learning to draw closer to God and growing as a team before going out as little missions teams. And that's where God really started cracking me. At that point, I had hardened and closed myself off enough that I had maybe cried twice in the last 5 years. And I remember this moment praying in boot camp, where God made it clear that He had to soften me. I came back renewed, happily plugged in and connected, but unfortunately my meisms eventually got the better of me. There was that transitional time when Andrew moved on to being the associate pastor, and Tim came in as the new youth pastor. I will note I had a bad attitude about this from the beginning. I remember when we were getting ready for a new pastor, he was sitting there in youth and telling Andrew to just make sure he didn't wear skinny leg jeans because I couldn't deal with that kind of pastor. Anyway, Tim came in and pushed right from the beginning, and my walls went up and my stubbornness came out, and there was no part of me at 14 or 15 that was able to self-reflect and be like, I'm not dealing well with this transition, I feel abandoned, I don't like change, my security is gone. And there was no part of me that identified my father wound had been reactivated because it didn't affect me. I just got into a fight over the couches. We had them in a circle, and he needed them in rows. And so the fight went on for a few weeks, and the youth group did eventually win. He had this, I went to Bible college, I know it is best attitude, and I had this, I don't want you here, and you are pushing me attitude. So I didn't really try hard to like him for an extended amount of time. But we made it work for a little while. And then I went to go help do the music for our children's program, Kids Life. I couldn't deal with him, so I came up with some dumb excuses without really saying anything and slowly ghosted myself out of the youth group. My hurting heart went south, and things were going bad with the youth group as a whole. I definitely did not keep my opinions to myself, and when the board asked me what was happening in youth, I was very willing to express everything I thought he was doing wrong. He decided he didn't want the other half of his position, which was janitorial work, and much to my pleasure, he ended up getting let go around the time we left Calvary for the second stint at Marine. I was totally in major geographies, and God had to work on me quite a bit with that one. I will say, by the grace and forgiveness of God, Tim and I were able to connect this past winter. We talked over what went wrong, what went down there, and both offer each other forgiveness and understanding. How things went when we went back to Marine, though, was interesting because this time I was a saved person. And although very fractured, started taking steps. I did not go into it with a well-placed heart, but God did use that church to grow me. I struggled with the differences in beliefs when it came to standards, and when one of the sticking points for me was this standard on dress. Leadership believed that women were to be in skirts/dresses only, and after extensively researching it, I did not agree with their position. I met with a pastoral couple and we discussed it, and where I would still be able to serve in the church if I took membership without holding to that. I did end up putting myself forward for membership and started serving in the church in the areas that were allowed for a woman to serve in without wearing skirts. I continued to struggle though, because it was one piece that was preventing me from serving fully. So about a year later, I found an overriding belief that if I were to be in this church under the authority that God had set, I would willingly comply with a belief that I myself did not hold. To start, at the time, to the best of my knowledge and growth, my heart was in the right place. I revamped my wardrobe, cut some stuff out of my life, and was able to eventually start teaching Sunday school. Unfortunately, as a leader, I learned that my place was to be a living church standard, not a bearer of grace and love and care. Looking back, there was a lot of growth moments. I started into Faith Bible Institute, which is a 3-year college-level Bible course, and there were a few major heart moments, especially in the first 2 semesters. But again, I let getting upset with the pastor and not resolving it get into my heart. Personally, I felt the grades I was able to get meant more to the pastor than what God had done in my heart. I ended up silently quitting after the instructor infuriated me by a misinterpretation of the rod of correction. He's from Louisiana, so what he did and advocated for was completely legal there, but it is in no way beneficial to a child, especially in a Sunday school setting. In the congregation, there was a later issue with the father being arrested with his form of self-proclaimed biblical discipline that followed the pro method and both what this instructor had taught. And it was at that point that I started letting unforgiveness set in. I was struggling with my relationship with God. I let these standards start defining my relationship, and I couldn't hold to them good enough. To be clear, I believed in the free gift of salvation, but I almost always had to prove myself. I remember one depressive spiral, laying there, knowing I didn't have the authority to end my life, but feeling like such a burden that I thought God was stupid for coming, that I wasn't worth the oxygen the trees gave me. I knew somewhere that I was supposed to ask for help, to depend on Him. But remember back to the beginning when I said that people relate to me as the manager and trainer based off of who I am and those that have held my title in their lives? Well, my dad shared that father title with God. So how I related to God the Father was through a man who didn't have the capacity to love and care for me. My entire childhood and teenage years were work and perform for your father's love and approval, and your worth is tied to how independent and strong you can be. Needing my dad was the biggest way to be rejected, and I would have never dared to tell him I needed help. If needed, I could normally get by manipulating him and stroking his ego. My place as a child was not to be loved and cared for, but to bring my father glory when he needed an ego boost for his friends. So sitting there, I could not understand God, and I told him this. I also could not understand the church and pastor. Everything in me was so standards and serving focused that I didn't have the foundational elements of heart posture anymore. I was struggling with massive amounts of anxiety, both from my crumbling relationship with God and inability to handle a very unbiblically angry assistant pastor. I thought of leaving, however, instead met with the pastor to revoke my member in good status standing and quit teaching Sunday school because I could no longer meet the standards of being at the assistant pastor's service. Things held out from there. I grew a bit, I backslid a bit, I continued on. Things got better in a way. But I had also decided to stay quiet behind a mask. In the end of 2020, we moved to Darfield and continued to drive into Kamloops to attend Marine. However, during COVID, started to watch the services here sometimes. When outdoor services were able to start meeting, we went to Bereen up until Easter and just after. The last time I sang there would have been a few weeks after Easter of 2021. Before my mom decided to come here, which is where you all have been part of the story and seen it play out. What you probably didn't see was me return to Bereen for a few months. After 5 years at Bereen, learning my proper place and willfully living by a set of rules, everything here was so foreign that I wasn't able to handle it. I had learned to be a living church standard, but I really didn't have a life with Christ anymore. So I walked through the motions in a desert of backsliding, confused. And this is where I have to pause and thank John, because one of the first sermons I remember actually listening to, there was a piece in it where he was talking about the desert and desert times and coming back. And it gave me so much encouragement through my journey to coming back, and especially the Bible study series on Jonah and all that encouragement. So thank you very much for letting God use you in that way in my life. But I do remember thinking, I can't work 6 days and then be here on my 7th. I had friends back in Kamloops, and I went back there with my eldest sister, which is when I wrote, I'm floundering, and I don't know what I'm doing. Up until this point, I had always followed my mother's choice in church and learned to adapt to the authority there. I didn't have a sense of discernment, and I sure didn't know how to follow God's leading in making decisions. There was this awkward time, now in my 3rd stint with Bereen, where neither them or I were sure if I was back or not. I prayed and asked for prayer, but was entirely divided and unsure until what felt like the ultimate pastoral betrayal happened. Scrolling through Facebook, I saw our pastor, the man who had told me one could not hold office or teach without adhering to the standards of the Constitution, had completely gone against it. Now everything I held had to be judged off of. Would I do it for $100,000? I was losing my religion. I had become someone I didn't know anymore, and I didn't have my standards to rely on for safety. Work highlighted personal traumas and stresses, and in July of 2022, I was left not knowing who I was and if there was a God anymore. My sense of being had become so codependent on what the titles and actions of being a Christian were that I had failed to depend on God himself. I had learned to comply with and follow a pastor and church. So much that when I looked at what Greg had done, I said to myself, if this is a man of God, then there is no God. And if there is no God, then I have the authority to end my life. I recorded a goodbye song, not knowing if I would make it to work the next day, or if it would just serve as a reminder of what the darkness felt like. I was used to living with high-functioning anxiety and on and off again depression for years, but circumstances had changed, and I had finally spiraled so hard that I scared myself. In preparation for this, I was looking through some old emails, and I found a list of questions that I had emailed my youth pastor, Andrew, in 2014 for it was a school assignment, and I needed to interview him. And this is what he said about doubt. I have doubted the existence of God, but in almost all cases, upon reflection, I have doubted him because of trying and confusing life circumstances. When either I have clarified my view of things, or those certain circumstances have passed, it's then that I resolve in faith to know him again and trust in his existence and presence. Yes, he's real, but that's a matter of opinion. Knowing God is a matter of faith, just as knowing the gravity is also a matter of faith. You could explain very well that gravity is a constant and sure fact, but as long as the possibility exists that under specific circumstances it wouldn't work, then it's not a sure thing, is it? Let me go out on a limb. I believe you can't actually prove the existence of God. But let me also say God doesn't feel any obligation to prove his existence. When he does reveal himself, he does so out of delight. Later in that question and answer set, he says, it only takes one answered prayer to know that he can be trusted. Answered prayer is strong evidence that his character is primarily one made of goodness and love. Character that is pure goodness and unconditional love is the only kind that is trustworthy. And if there is one prayer that God has carried me through in teaching me, it's, how can I trust you? And let me tell you, it's still a bit terrifying, and I'm not good at giving up my independence. And I have a remarkably low capacity to trust at times. But as I look throughout my life, I cannot find one instance where God's love and provision of care was not there. I just couldn't always see it, let alone feel it. There have been so many answered prayers in the last 2 years. They say it's always darkest before dawn, and this rings true in my story. 2022 was an incredibly dark summer, and working through everything that brought me to this point, challenging the lies I believed, and learning of God's true fatherly care has been an amazing journey full of ups and downs. In youth, I would have never thought Andrew could have wavered. Leaders, in my experience, did not do or show that. We kept a shield of perfection on, but all of humanity is fallible. And to project otherwise is to live bearing a false witness, as I did for a few years at Berean. There's a messy side to the rawness and realness of living in relationship, where authenticity is painfully vulnerable, because to embrace being human is to embrace the fact that we live in a broken world without the power to fix it, but to allow Christ's care to shine through into our lives and the lives of those around us, making the path for ultimate restoration in him. So to quote from Andrew again, before anything was created, God existed, and he existed in relationship with himself as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This fellowship that he expresses in himself is perfect and good to the fullest degree. His desire in creating humans, despite their propensity to sin, was to share that same fellowship. Put in this way, the desire God has for sharing his very own love is greater than the loss of having his own creation rejected. Far better for some to experience the fullness of his love and glory, while the majority, say, refuse it, than to not have anyone experience it outside of himself. A risk worth taking, you could say. It is in this acknowledgement that God is not out there looking for dutiful service or a living standard or strong, perfect leaders to shine for him, but rather his fallible and fallen humans to accept his love and care and then reciprocate that love from a willing and tenderly cared for heart that has brought and is continuing to bring myself to a deep safety in him. Taking my depression, my need for deep rest, and finding that deep rest in his unconditional love and care. It is with joy that I am able to be here today, singing again and serving with a heart for God and abiding in the deep love of Jesus.